Watch this vidcast, or I'll gouge your eyes out.
Welcome back, horror hounds, to Ghostman and Rivera's Horror Show podcast.
Hello, I'm Mike Ghostman Pickle.
And I am James Rivera. Let's get it started with
Horror Show News.
The final It Chapter 2 trailer drops, and it's coming September 6th.
a real 3 from Hell trailer drops.
Oliver Jackson Cohen from Haunting of Hill House is cast in the lead role of Lee Whannell's Invisible Man.
Jordan Peele's Candyman to begin filming this August.
The 10th season of The Walking Dead coming October 6th.
Mindhunter Season 2 coming August 16th.
And Scooby-Doo Return to Zombie Island is coming October 1st to video on demand and DVD. We'll get right to discussing our news stories for this week. There's always quite a bit. There's always something happening in horror that we need to talk about.
I was already impressed for the first trailer of the new It. It didn't give too much away, but it gave one scene, and that scene was very creepy and well directed. So let's take a look at our new trailer for It. This is a more expansive trailer, and we are going to play it for you on our podcast right now.
And I've left. I remember all of it.
Shows the sewers being flooded.
Very...
Pennywise waiting at the shore to pull somebody out and devour them.
The Losers Club all grown up.
Swear?
Does the obligatory shots between the kids and then the adult versions of them, which are all really good and well cast.
This is a big A-list cast for this movie. It's for a horror movie, an R-rated horror movie. This has a lot of big movie stars in it. Some imagery inside of one of those circus kind of mazes. Those reflecting glasses that get confusing. James McAvoy walking through, looking terrified. Looks really well shot.
Yeah.
So is that...
Shows Pennywise with a long-ass tongue.
ready to attack a little kid as James McAvoy is frantically trying to break through the glass. Doesn't Pennywise sound a little bit more hoarse in this?
Yeah.
It sounds, his voice is a little more like an aggressive whisper this time. So, do you think they're going to have the original cast of kids in this? Because they keep showing them. I wonder if they're going to have them in flashback, some of the original actors.
Yeah, I believe so. And it looks like they're going to add more of the story of the kids to it. Oh, I like Georgie right here.
Witness the end. That's what the trailer says. Of it. Witness the end of it.
The visuals look really impressive.
That looks like a human Pennywise. It Chapter 2. I'll be damned. It looks pretty damn impressive. You know, I've read a lot of Stephen King, though I have a copy of It. I've never actually read it because it is so damn long that every time I've started it up, and I've started it several times and gotten for the first 20 pages, I look at it and I get intimidated and I end up putting it back on the shelf.
It's the Bible of horror novels.
Yeah, so I don't even know what's gonna come at the end of this because my only frame of reference is the original made-for-TV miniseries with Tim Curry.
Yeah, I can only assume the big spider creatures is going to make an appearance, and I can only assume it's going to be much better than the miniseries was.
Much more terrifying. Between this and Dr. Sleep, I'm pretty excited for my Stephen King coming up at the end of the year.
Yeah, I was excited at that first trailer because it showed a lot of that one scene with the old lady.
And Jessica Chastain.
I like that it showed such a tempered kind of well-paced little scene and almost showing the full thing. On this one, I liked how they showed like the more gave you a little more scope of what the movie's going to look like, how exciting it's going to be, how dramatic it's going to be. It seemed to be more dramatic moments in this one.
I hear Pennywise is going to be angrier. It's going to be a little bit more vicious and pissed off in this one. So if it all comes out well, this might very well be better than the first one, or scarier.
The cinematography looks really impressive. The acting looks like it's going to be good. The horror scenes were really well shot.
I am looking forward to it. Another thing I'm looking forward to is 3 from Hell. We actually talked about this on the podcast already when Rob Zombie hyped up that trailer that we were awaiting with bated breath.
Yeah.
And it was nothing. It was a teaser that really didn't give out any information. More than half of it was clips from House of a Thousand Corpses and Devil's Rejects.
Yeah.
And not even enough to judge anything about it. And it was hyped up so much, and it ended up being a real dud. He dropped a real 3 from Hell trailer without announcing it and without, giving any anticipation and build-up. And it looks fucking good. This looks brutal. It looks kind of dirty. It looks exciting. It looks like another throwback to those 1970s horror movies that Rob Zombie loves so much.
Yeah.
And I just don't understand. He should have just dropped the teaser trailer without any word and hyped up this trailer, because this is a real trailer that gives you a sense of what the movie's going to look like, of what it's going to sound like, some of the idea of what it's going to be about. And it got me excited.
And I don't understand that strategy of hyping up this little teaser and then not saying anything and just releasing
a really good trailer.
Yeah.
It looks like it's going to be a good follow-up to The Devil's Rejects as far as I can tell.
I'm beginning to have a theory of why this is going to be such a limited release. It looks like it's really going to be brutal. So I think he might have stuck to his guns, making it as brutal as possible. And maybe that wasn't
studio friendly.
Wasn't going over well with the bigger theater chains.
What I found most interesting about the trailer is that it kind of addresses the big shootout at the end of The Devil's Rejects, where we presume they all died in that shootout at the end with the police.
Yeah, and it says their chance of survival is 1,000,000 to 1, so they address how impossible it is that they're going to survive.
And they survive, and I think that kind of, when I first thought about it, I thought, it's a little ridiculous, isn't it? Then I stopped and I thought about it more. I'm like, actually, no. For the mythology of these characters, it actually makes them seem more evil or more menacing. The fact that all 3 of them survived a ridiculous shootout that nobody would ever have a chance to survive kind of makes the mythology behind them a little scarier.
Yeah. And it gave me some Natural Born Killers vibes.
With all the people cheering them on, they seem to have garnered a lot of fans. People saying shit like, free the 3.
Yeah, and then Baby was saying kill 'em all in a similar way that Mallory said it on
Natural Born Killers.
It looks really good, really solid. And another one that looks like it's going to have good visuals, but in a grittier, kind of nastier way. Were you like me? It looks dangerous, like the Devil's Rejects was?
It looks like it's very anti-mainstream, and it looks like this is being marketed to hardened horror fans. The very aggressive nature of horror that looks like it revels in the brutality and the sadism of it, which, to be fair, is not every person's brand of horror.
Yeah.
But if you're into it, it looks like it's going to be Nirvana.
More reason to be excited about that one for sure, and a much better, a real trailer this time.
You're listening to Ghostman and Rivera's Horror Show podcast.
And our next story is Oliver Jackson Cohen. If you're not sure who that is, he was from Netflix's Haunting of Hill House, the Mike Flanagan movie. And this time he's going to be in Lee Whannell's Invisible Man. This was originally supposed to be part of the Dark Universe, like they were going to bring the Universal Monsters back. And The Mummy pretty much ruined that. The Dark Universe tanked after that, and it wasn't long before The Bride of Frankenstein was canceled just before pre-production. So then Lee Whannell and Jason Blum went off on their own, and they wanted to continue doing The Invisible Man. I guess it's I assume it's going to be a good script from Lee Whannell because he's a really good writer. Johnny Depp was originally attached to the role, so when they left on their own, they kind of dropped the idea of having Johnny Depp in the lead role. And I'm much more excited knowing that this new guy, a fresher face, is going to be the Invisible Man.
It would have seemed almost hokey if Johnny Depp were going to be the Invisible Man, almost like a studio cash grab, just putting this big star in a role that doesn't really feel right. And I feel like, Johnny Depp has played so many eccentric characters at this point that I'd rather see somebody fresh. And I really like this guy, Oliver Jackson Cohen. I thought he was probably one of the very best performers in The Haunting of Hill House.
He had one of the juicier parts, too.
Yeah, being an addict and all. And he has a lot of star power. I don't know how to describe it, but he has a screen presence, so it doesn't surprise me he's actually a model beyond being an actor. So hopefully he does a good job, just as good as he did in The Haunting of Hill House.
This Invisible Man is also going to star Elizabeth Moss, and she's going to play a character named Cecilia, who receives news of her abusive ex-boyfriend's suicide. She begins to rebuild her life for the better. However, her sense of reality is put into question when she begins to suspect that her deceased lover is not actually dead. So it's different from the original Universal monster movie, Invisible Man.
I'm glad it's going to be different. If they're going to tackle this concept again, there's no reason to just repeat what they did in the past. Try to do something fresh or new. As it is, I don't know, it's bad enough that most of Hollywood is made of remakes now. If you're going to do it, take a fresh angle. Don't just repeat the same formula.
Yeah, I haven't really been interested in any of these new Universal monster movies. And I would normally be interested in this one, but I'm a big fan of Lee Winnell, and anything he writes, I'm going to be there to check it out.
To be honest, that's the main reason I'm interested in this. If this had like a no-name director attached to it, and it just seemed like it was Universal going through with their dark universe, I probably wouldn't have cared. But after Lee Winnell's last film, Upgrade, I'm actually looking forward to seeing what else he's going to do as a filmmaker.
He impressed as a director for sure.
Speaking of remakes and reboots, Jordan Peele's Candyman will start filming in August. It's going to wrap sometime in the fall. They're aiming for a June 12th, 2020 release date. It's going to be written by Jordan Peele, directed by Nia DaCosta, and it will film exclusively in Chicago. So it's going to be like the original one, taking place in Chicago. Cabrini Green, as far as I know, the original project for from the first Candyman doesn't exist anymore. They've rebuilt it over. So I wonder if they're going to try to recreate it or move the story around.
That's what I heard. I heard they were going to completely replicate Cabrini Green, where it looks realistic. It looks just like it.
So this is a continuation of the Candyman mythology from the original one, even though it's a reboot, right?
Yeah, and I believe this Candyman is supposed to be the same Candyman
character
as before, just a different actor.
And Tony Todd is still going to have a part in it. We don't know how big it is, if it's going to be a cameo or a significant supporting role. But that's almost like a blessing of goodwill to have the original Candyman on board with this project.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that the first one was only 6 days of it were filmed in the city of Chicago, and the rest of it was filmed on the LA soundstage. But this one is exclusively going to be filmed in Chicago.
This is another one where if it wasn't for the talents involved, I probably wouldn't be as interested in it. Kind of like the Dark Universe. The idea of a Candyman just sounds like, kind of like, oh, we're going to do this again. But the fact that it's Jordan Peele, and the original Candyman did deal with a lot of social commentary, the type that's right up Jordan Peele's alley.
Yeah.
And the fact that he's continuing the story, and we know that Jordan Peele is a die-hard horror fan, so I imagine he's going to try to do the story justice. And his style of writing, I think, from Get Out to Us, does fit Candyman. I've seen a lot of people online getting angry about it, thinking he's going to make it overly political. I'm like, newsflash, the original one already had a deep political message embedded within it, so this is nothing new, or it's not really that shocking to me.
And I don't think anything he's done is really overly political.
No, it's only vaguely political, I guess. It kind of just taps into current issues, and I think a lot of people get overly sensitive anytime you inject social commentary into my horror.
Yeah.
Even though it's been there since Night of the Living Dead, going back, horror has always been used as a vehicle for social commentary. So I don't see any validity behind those complaints.
Stop making horror intelligent. How dare you?
Yeah, I know. So this one, because of the talents involved and because Tony Todd is giving his blessing, I'm particularly interested in seeing where they take the story and how they're going to transplant it into the modern era.
And I'm really excited. Jordan Peele's another one. I'm really excited to see whatever he does. Even though I didn't like Us that much, I like that he came right out of the box and got some recognition from the Academy and got some Oscar nominations and some wins, and then he's gonna still stay a horror guy. Like, yes, stay in
he
horror.
Didn't sell out.
Give us some more original horror.
Staying true to his vision, and for this reason, we at the Horror Show couldn't be happier for this.
Yeah. Some news that I'm not so excited about is the 10th season with The Walking Dead. If you've been listening to this podcast, you know that I defended The Walking Dead for the longest, and it kind of went off the rails for me. And everything I hear about it just seems silly now. Apparently, the trailer is already out. It was to be released. We're recording on Thursday.
But it'll be
So-
out by the time you hear this podcast. There'll
Yeah.
be a Walking Dead trailer available.
But it's
For those
gonna
10 of you still interested.
Yeah. Well, it's going to release at San Diego Comic Con, so I can only assume it's going to release on the internet soon after that. Already, the official log line of this season is in the fight against the Whisperers. There's no going back.
That sounds so corny.
I'm already off. I'm already not interested because of that. So then, I hate to talk shit about this lady, but she just is not making it sound any better. Here's what showrunner Angela Kang says. I'm sure she's a nice lady and everything, and I'm sure she's talented, but I just don't know what she's doing with this show. She says things are going to pick up with a little bit more of a time passage. Not a giant one like we've had, but winter will be over, and people are going to be in a different emotional space. I'm working on the premiere, and we're gonna. I don't know. I'm crazy.
What?
I was like, let's just do snow, which is actually impossible to do. What
How
are
is
you
it impossible
talking
to
about?
do?
First of all,
It's always becoming incoherent.
she just said that winter will be over and people will be in a different emotional space, and then she said, I don't know, let's do snow. It just seems too flighty for a show that's in
So
trouble.
there's other stuff where I'm like, I must be psychotic because let's just do more stuff we've never done on the show that feels impossible. This is also from the quote, and there's nothing impossible. That's part of the fun of the show. Obviously, there are some problems to be worked out with the Whispers, these crazy neighbors that come in and out and cause chaos in the world. There's something to play out, and obviously there will be other storylines that are kind of intersecting with all of this. Very vague. It's always fun to have more than one thing going on at once, not if you don't know how to concentrate on individual plot lines to make them get them for maximum effect.
And it's kind of a concept of a episodic show, isn't it?
We'll find out how this radio voice, what they have to do with our people in the world. We're having fun working on the pieces of the season, so hopefully it will go well. I'm knocking on a lot of wood. So she says, we're having a lot of fun working on these pieces of the season. I imagine that they're having more fun working on it than fans are watching it these days anyway. So hopefully at least somebody's having fun.
It sounds way too much like she's throwing a lot of stuff up against the wall and seeing what'll stick. And that's not
nothing
what that show
indica-
needs right now.
And nothing in here indicates a direction forward for the show either.
No.
Nothing, no clear ideas, no clear concepts. It's just, ooh, I have all these wild ideas. Let's just throw them. We're going to be snow. And I'm so psychotic. I'm like, so it's just going to be another season with no direction and a bunch of shit going on in different directions and an inability to focus on one thing. I've been over the show for a very long time now, and this does not convince me that it's going to end on a high note. And it only sounds like it's going to get worse from here on out.
No, and it lost me, and I was die hard.
Oh, that's too bad. Well, some shows, they end great and they know when to cut their time off and they exit the stage before they become outplayed. The Walking Dead just is not one of those shows.
Well, one of the great things about The Walking Dead is they have some great stories to go by, so they have good source material. But this lady's coming in and saying, let's just try this and try that, instead of just making the stories that you have really well and effective.
And we reported on this either last week or 2 weeks ago. The Walking Dead comic has finally come to an end. So basically, Angela Kang, the showrunner, has a template of how to end it. She has a template.
Yeah.
And instead, she just seems like she just wants to do a bunch of willy-nilly stuff that's just going to suspend it for as long as possible until AMC can get another hit on their hands.
Yeah.
Bad idea.
I mean, it could possibly surprise us, and these
It
be
probably
really
won't.
some crazy off-the-wall changes that end up being good. But just judging from her saying, I don't know, let's do snow, it just doesn't sound like it's very well thought out. But
one thing I am looking forward to a lot more is Season 2 of Mindhunter. It'll be hitting Netflix this August 16th. And, David Fincher has been one of my favorite filmmakers working at David Fincher, who's directed many of the episodes, and the executive producer on it is coming back. This one is going to feature Charles Manson and the Son of Sam. The agents consult them to solve the Atlanta child murders from 1979 to 1981. At least 28 African American children, teenagers, and adults were killed. Damon Harriman will be playing Manson, the same actor playing Manson in Tarantino's upcoming Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
It's very
so
interesting.
This actor got 2 big breaks. He was already in Mindhunter before he auditioned for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and Tarantino was not even aware that he was already playing Charles Manson for David Fincher.
wow.
So if he auditioned without the knowledge that he's already a Manson, he must be a damn good Charles Manson. If independently David Fincher and Tarantino decided he was the best Charles Manson, without knowledge of each other's projects, in my opinion, that speaks to what a good Manson this guy must be.
Yeah, that's two legendary directors, and this is an infamous character that only a handful of people could play really well. And for these two legendary directors to pick the same guy is just amazing.
For those in the audience who don't know, Mindhunter is a show about a couple of FBI agents, and it is based on a true story. About the 1970s, when they noticed that a lot of the FBI started noticing a lot of crimes became less rational. They didn't make sense. So they started, studying the psychology of serial killers, and that's how the term serial killers came to be.
Yeah, those agents actually coined the term, yeah.
So those two FBI agents did a lot of research by interviewing different serial killers, learning about their backgrounds, learning about their upbringings, to have a better grasp and understanding on their motives. So it's not necessarily a horror show, but it veers so much into horror because it deals with serial killers and it's so dark that I think most horror fans would be delighted to watch something like this, especially if you're into serial killers or the psychology of it, or if it fascinates you.
Yeah.
This is the show for you.
You don't just see the serial killers and see them in the story, you get inside their minds. And you see these FBI agents who get in trouble with their peers because the FBI at the time, in general, didn't believe in talking to these people. They didn't like the idea. They just wanted them to rot in jail, and they wanted to forget that they existed. But these two agents came up, and from what I hear, it's a few agents kind of melded into two characters. But they really went forward with the coining the serial killer term and insisting that if we get inside these killers' heads, we can figure out how to solve these current cases that we have.
A lot better, and it ended up doing a lot of good. So it's a fascinating true story with David Fincher's direction, who after Seven and Zodiac and The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo and all the dark films that he's done, he's a perfect match for this material, and it's also really suspenseful, really well acted, very insightful. Also has interesting character drama, really well shot, and has that signature David Fincher look.
Yeah,
I think
it reminds me very much of Zodiac.
Yeah, it's almost like a companion piece to Zodiac, I would say. So this is something I am much, much, much more excited for.
Great cast too, and the whole look of it. It's kind of a period piece.
The late 70s, early 80s.
And our final news story is one that James is especially excited for. Scooby-Doo: Return to Zombie Island is coming October 1st. It's a sequel to 1998's Zombie Island, which I didn't see, but James did.
Yeah, so this is probably the goofiest news story, and I insisted that we report on it. It's more of horror for children. But if, like me, you're a millennial, you grew up in the 90s as a child, you probably watched Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island and loved the fuck out of it. I remember as a kid, it was the coolest version of Scooby-Doo because the concept was they were going to an island. And, in every Scooby-Doo mystery, they're always trying to see who's behind the mask. And this time, they spend so much time trying to figure out what the cause behind these zombies are that they don't realize that everything on this island that they're visiting is real. The black magic is real. The zombies are real. The voodoo rituals are real. There's nothing to solve or get behind. They just have to face down evil. And I always thought that was a really cool concept, a really cool direction to take Scooby-Doo in. And as a child who loved, cartoons and stuff like that and loved horror movies, it was the perfect combination of the two for me, as for my imagination at that age.
Because they were all so formulaic, like it was always somebody dressed in a costume or...
Yeah, they were always pretending to be a ghost or pretending to be something. They were always less than what they turned out to be. It was you. It was always those damn meddling kids. Yeah. This one...
There's always some plan to get somebody off their land or some shit like that.
Not with this one. This one, they dealt with real rituals and real voodoo, black magic. So I don't know how they're going to return to it because that storyline seems to be resolved. I'm going to check it out just because I was a big fan of it, and I still like Scooby-Doo quite a bit.
Yeah.
I just hope it's not a soulless cash grab that I end up being disappointed in one of those situations where they're just trying to bank on nostalgia.
And that trailer you played was for the original, right? Not the new one?
No, that's for the new one.
And even though they were bad movies, Matthew Lillard did a pretty good Shaggy in the movies, live action ones.
Yeah, he's probably exactly as you'd imagine Shaggy to be if he were a real person. Not good
Yeah.
movies by any means, but he did fit the role quite well.
And Linda Cardellini was actually a good Velma too. I don't
Oh
know
yeah,
about the
that's
rest.
right. I forgot that she was Velma.
Oh, and then Sarah Michelle Gellar was Daphne.
Daphne, and then we had Freddie Prinze Jr. in there as well.
Yeah, you
That
think,
cast is so 90s.
yeah, and you think that would have worked, but
I'd rather go back and watch the cartoons and see the live actions again.
Listen to this podcast, or I'll gut you.
So now we'll move on to what we watched this week. The first thing I watched is a brand new movie in the theaters, Crawl. Alexander Aja's alligator movie.
We've been following it on the podcast for a while, so what do you think of it now that you've actually seen the finished product?
This is bringing up the average for my 2019 horror viewing because this one, another one that was actually good. And going along with everything else that I've liked in 2019 is a very simple story, a very really tight, really well done exercise in horror, and this one was a monster movie, which just so happens to be a very realistic monster movie despite having so much CGI.
It was very well received from audiences seem to be responding to it well. It's gotten really good reviews. It's had solid box office, 12 million in opening weekend, nothing spectacular, but it's more than making back its budget.
I mean, everything's good about it. Dare I say it's a little better than competent. Basically, I say that because there's not very much originality, but the drama is real. The story is good. The acting is good. It centers around a father and a daughter, and they really feel like a father and a daughter. And you root for their struggle, and you're anxious for them when the alligators come after them. And it has the added element of the girl being a swimmer, so you see her doing the really fast swimming and swim meets at the beginning. So it's fun to see a really athletic person who can swim well try to get around these alligators when everybody's dying around them.
So it's a really simplistic, basic B-movie monster premise, but it's in the execution where it counts.
Yeah, basically it's during a hurricane. The levees outside of this town break, and once they break, it comes in and floods it, and then once it floods, all the gators from the surrounding swamps just kind of go through looking for a meal.
So these aren't like mutant alligators or giant alligator monsters or
No, not at all.
like exaggerated B-movie creations. These are just real alligators.
Yeah. And
Okay, that makes it kind of interesting because most of the time with monster movies like this, when you go in that direction, they try to put on a sci-fi twist to it to make them more extravagant or like, bending the rules of reality.
Yeah. And it's largely done in one location, like they're kind of trapped in this girl's basement or in her father's basement. And he's kind of stuck down there, so she's trying to get him out without these alligators eating him.
Any good gore in there?
Yeah, some actually really good gore. I knew that Alexander Aja was not going to disappoint as far as that goes. And one thing I was looking for was the death roll, which is when a gator gets a hold of you and he wants to completely incapacitate you. He goes into death roll while you're in his mouth. So I was really hoping they'd show that, and one of the big gators gets this girl in a death roll.
So this is no
Awesome scene.
anaconda then?
Yeah.
Okay.
But one thing I would say, as realistic as it is and as good as the CGI is, the only thing I would complain about is the father and daughter both go through an ungodly amount of punishment that you think, can a person really survive through that? It gets almost ridiculous, but still really well done.
I got to check it out then.
So I'd highly recommend that one just for the excitement factor and the realistic look of it. There's something about the color correction that keeps the realism throughout. It's a type of color correction where you're looking at darkness and you're seeing a little bit more than you should have. You know what I mean?
Where in
Because
reality you might see less if it were that dark.
Yeah, exactly. Where things that you can really see colors kind of standing out, but they're like the green of the trees is really a dark forest green because they bumped up the contrast. So that look throughout really helps bring you into the movie because you kind of feel like you're there with them. Where if you were really watching it like it is through the camera lens, then you wouldn't be able to see shit.
Interesting.
I don't know if I'm making that clear or not.
No, I understand what you mean.
So that's I had a good time at the theater with that one.
So that is the current movie, the current horror movie playing right now, the most current. I actually watched Scream Resurrection, the entire miniseries revival of the Scream television series that started out on MTV for the first 2 seasons, and it moved over to VH1 for this 3rd season. And it aired over 3 nights, 2 episodes a night, and it returns to more of the original concept of what Scream was. And overall, I have to say it's a mixed bag. I need to start off with the negatives first. Some of the dialogue in the Scream Resurrection is awkward. Some of the acting is questionable at times. The acting is a mix between good, bad, and okay. Sometimes within the same performance. I guess it depends on who's directing the episode.
Okay.
The directors of Starry Eyes and Pet Sematary direct a couple of episodes of this, and they do they do a pretty competent job with the film, with the TV series. It's a little bit awkward at times. Some of it's a little bit goofy. There's a lot wrong with it. Some of the reasoning is a little bit convoluted, and some of the character motivations are laughable. And like I said, I can understand why a lot of it didn't get a very good reaction from people, and I could get like a lot of horror fans might not like this. But despite all that, I actually enjoyed this anyway. One of the things that I did like about it, part of it was a little bit of the fan service. I love that Roger L. Jackson has returned to the voice of Ghostface. It feels right. They've returned to the original mask. They've returned to the original meta aspect of it. So it feels a little bit truer to Scream. And despite all of its flaws, it works, for me anyway, it worked phenomenally as a whodunit, as a mystery as to who the killer is. Because even in between some of the cheesier stuff and a lot of some of the goofy melodrama, I was genuinely like really trying to figure out who the killer was. And as the series progresses over the course of 6 episodes, it really keeps you on your feet. Almost every character at one point you're going to suspect is the killer, and you're going to suspect strongly. Just when you think you got it and you think, oh, that person did it, you know that she did it, you know that she's the killer, then something happens that puts that in doubt, and like, maybe she's not the killer, maybe he's the killer. This would make sense. And then you start leaning into this person, and then somebody else says something that could make them a suspect. Or like the entire time, I'm going through the ringer with almost every character I suspected of being the killer strongly at some point, which I've never seen in a whodunit. There's always like the group of people that you don't expect and the group of people who you know for sure didn't do it. This one, almost every character at some point. And then and it does another interesting thing. You start suspecting characters who are really unsuspecting at first. You're like, no, they would never be the killer. Wait, they probably are the killer. And it keeps you guessing, and it keeps us going all the way up until the end. So I'm surprised with despite some of the limitations on some of the material, they made it an exciting whodunit, and it has very good kill scenes.
Okay.
It has really inventive kill scenes. One of them involves a bone saw and an old school elevator, and somebody being dragged with a bone saw until they're split all the way down their center. Almost Terrifier style,
Terrifier,
but
nice.
a little bit different, but pretty cool. There's another one that involves a needle to an eyeball to overdose somebody. So that one was a nice little surprise.
Eyeball stuff's always good.
And Ghostface is a little bit more imaginative as a killer than he was in the original series. Don't get me wrong, the original Scream movies are far better than the Scream Resurrection. But the Ghostface in this is a lot more inventive with his kills. He doesn't just stick to stabbing people, basically. He goes through all kinds of different little processes and things that he does. A couple of things that shock you a little bit, like, oh shit, I never seen a Scream kill like that before. So the whodunit aspects of it really keep it really compulsively watchable despite its litany of flaws. It keeps it really watchable, and the gore is always interesting. And in between some of the awkward stuff, there's some good acting peeking through. I really liked Kiki Palmer in this. I think she was a standout.
Okay.
I liked R.J. Seiler as the main character, Dion. Occasionally, he wasn't given much to work with. Sometimes his character is interesting and sometimes not. He's actually in Me, Earl, and the Dying Girl.
Oh, okay.
As the best friend. So he was pretty solid in it, given what he was given. Yeah, so I really liked him in it. One of the biggest surprise for me was finding out that one of the characters whose name is Amir, is played by C.J. Wallace, is the son of Christopher Wallace, the notorious B.I.G. which I did not really expect. That threw me for a loop. One of my favorite hip-hop artists.
Yeah.
And now that I look back, he looks like him. He looks like his dad a little bit. So he plays kind of the nerd character in this. And there's like a little bit of a Breakfast Club element in it. So it's one of those series where some of it's all over the place, but I still was into it the entire time. And I would get why this has gotten negative reactions, but there was just enough in there for me to be interested the whole way through and to stick with it all the way to the end.
But does it get goofy after you find out who the killer is, like the original Scream did?
No, because there isn't much time after that. Like it doesn't swim in the once you know for sure. Unlike the original Screams, it doesn't swim in that detail for a very long time. Some of the goofiness comes before it, but it's satisfying in that way, where I was like, damn, it really kept me on my toes the entire time. Some of it was questionable, like I said, but the fan service, which admittedly is a very fanboy thing to get excited about, some of the original elements, the inventive kills, and the whodunit aspect make it a worthwhile watch for me.
Is it deliberately goofy or silly, or do the goofy or silly moments come up and you don't think they meant it to be silly?
I think some of them it was meant to be and it lands, and some of it is not meant to be and it comes across like that. So like I said, it's a really mixed bag where I don't even know how to describe it. You have to see it to understand what I mean.
Okay.
And there's some choices that are interesting, and I don't even know if they're good or bad. For example, there's a hook man, and there's a hook man in this new Scream. Reminded me a little bit of I Know What You Did Last Summer when I first saw it in the trailers. I was like, oh no, I hope they don't go that route. Yeah. And this actually has a bit of I Know What You Did Last Summer element. So there's a reason that hook is in there. It has a little bit of that type of plot line to go along with it. The hook man is played by none other than Tony Todd himself, Candyman. So I was like, that's kind of cool. Is it too meta? I'm not sure. Yeah. Does it work? Maybe. I don't know.
But, so he's a killer separate from Ghostface?
Yeah, he's somebody completely separate from Ghostface.
Okay.
Like I said, it was worth watching, but I comes with some reservations. Be warned, I'm not saying that this is a great series or it's a masterpiece. I just enjoyed it for what it was.
It had enough that you liked to keep you going and keep you interested throughout.
Yeah, and it's only 6 episodes. They're about 40-45 minutes long each. So it kind of comes out to like a long film.
So for the whodunit element, that's something that every classic whodunit has gone for, where it's they've tried to fool you into thinking that it's other characters.
This one actually succeeds at it, though. It succeeds at making almost every cast member seem like they could be guilty, to the point where I'm like, I have to stick with it to the end because I'm like, who the fuck is it? Where you start like looking, it almost starts driving you mad that you can't figure out who the killer is. Cool, so
I'll have to watch that.
Worth checking out, but don't expect something incredible. Just go in for the kills and for a clever, constantly shifting whodunit thriller.
And you didn't see the more teeny bopper MTV Scream series, right?
No, I didn't. I saw the first episode.
I watched that one. It's pretty good.
It got better. It was kind of right. I didn't really enjoy the episode that I saw, which is one of the reasons I never really continued with it. From what I understand, most people tell me that it got better in its second season.
Yeah, definitely. The first one just kept me holding on throughout. It didn't completely lose me, but it didn't blow me away either. And then the second one came along, and I was like, okay, this is more like it. And then it gets canceled. Just from what I hear, this sounds better than the MTV series, but I'll check it out and see for myself.
You watch anything else, Mr. Michael?
I went to a few. Most of what I watched this week was from horror events that I went to. One was like a horror nerd's dream, especially for me, because it had they played 2 movies at the Egyptian Theater in Hollywood that are very close to my heart. It was Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 and Return of the Living Dead. And for Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, Caroline Williams came, and she discussed the movie with the crowd. And it also had Linnea Quigley and Clu Gulager from Return of the Living Dead. So that was really cool. Clu was really old, but man, he was a spitfire.
What theater did you see this at again?
At the Egyptian Theater in Hollywood.
Always a great theater for these types of events.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite theaters to see a movie in. So they brought all of them up at the same time, so we got to hear all these stories from the set. And what I didn't realize was going to happen, I ended up liking Return of the Living Dead a lot more.
Really? More than Texas Chainsaw 2 on the big screen?
Yeah, because Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 is one of my favorite horror films of all time. And if you would ask me before this screening which was my favorite, I would tell you Texas Chainsaw 2. But after watching them together, I would have to say Return of the Living Dead. It just had more elements to it. There was more to it to entertain. There was a complexity to it. This just an amazing script. And you don't realize it because next to, I guess Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 seemed a little simple in comparison. Where Return of the Living Dead had some really interesting character arcs and some interesting dialogue going on amongst all this madness and zombies yelling brains, you know. And it was great to see the stars of them talk about it afterwards. Clue kept mentioning Linnea Quigley's nude scenes. Mm-hmm. And the crowd got admittedly uncomfortable, but Linnea was not. She was not uncomfortable in the least. She told some stories there, and then she's also saving some stories for a book she has coming out. And she said some of these stories she would just a few years ago she would have been scared to tell, but now she's like, I'm older and fuck it. And then Caroline Williams said almost the same type of thing, like I'm older now, fuck it. But in the context of she addressed Linnea Quigley's nudity too in both Night of the Demons. And
Carolyn Williams isn't somebody who's known for stripping down for nudity and those types. She wasn't that kind of scream queen.
No, and she mentioned that. She said we were both coming up in the genre at the time, and she said you like to get nude a lot, and I was a prude. I didn't get nude at all. And she said now that I'm in my 60s, fuck it, I get nude all the time. And then the very next day, I open up her Instagram and she's nude on the front with little pasties covering her nipples. It's great to see like these actresses come up out from under this feeling of being awkward, like they wouldn't be accepted, or it's some kind of taboo thing to show their bodies, and then just to get older and
not even care anymore.
Yeah, and to be appreciated for an older woman and not feel like she needs to hide her body at all, you know. But
in a way, it's kind of empowering.
Yeah, it was cool seeing these older ladies trade stories with this older man.
You're listening to Ghostman and Rivera's Horror Show Podcast.
It was directed by Dan O'Bannon, though The Return of the Living Dead was. And of course, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 was directed by the great Toby Hooper. So after the screening of these two great films, I got the immense honor of meeting Caroline Williams and taking a picture with her in the lobby. And
friendly?
Yes, very friendly. She loves her fans. She apparently goes to a lot of these screenings and all the horror events around town. This is like the 5th time I've seen her at one of these events in the last couple months. I took a picture with her, and I had planned on having this great conversation with her and telling her how much I loved Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. But just because it was so close to my heart, I just stood there and looked at her and said, I'm a big fan. I was like, what an idiot.
That's what happens sometimes. You freeze up when it's time to actually, say something.
You've interviewed some stars before. We've interviewed some together, and I've interviewed some myself.
But most of the people I've interviewed, for the most part, I went in there with the intention to interview them and came prepared with a set of questions in mind. And you were not in a context where you were there to interview her anyway. You were just meeting her as a person. So it makes sense that it wouldn't be exactly the same.
And she's larger than life to me. Stretch is someone I grew up with since I was younger. I was like 15, 16 when I first saw the movie.
You know, that's what I love about the horror genre is not just the genre itself. The people involved with it seem to really love what they do. The people involved in horror films, they love their fans. They love going to conventions. They love meeting the people that made them big.
Yeah.
They're very interactive with the community. It's the most of any film genre. It has the most accessible people in there and the one who are most friendly to fans. So that's another great thing about horror. It's a very tight-knit community, and the stars and the practitioners show a lot of love to their fans.
And I must say, overall, there's been a lot of female horror stars and filmmakers that I've met who were super friendly, where a lot of the guys are a little more crotchety, a little more of a smartass. Even the ones that were nice were kind of a smartass, like Sid Haig and Bill Moseley.
But that's what you'd expect from him. I enjoyed interviewing Sid Haig. He was a little bit cranky at first, but he was super friendly despite all. It almost felt like a playful kind of cranky.
Exactly.
Almost like when I first asked him for an interview, he's like, another one? All right, fuck it, let's do it.
Yeah.
And he just goes straight into it. And when he starts, he doesn't act like he's being forced. He gives good answers and everything. So I think some of the crotchetiness of some of the male horror stars is a little bit of, I don't know, humorous. I don't take it completely seriously.
They have this tough exterior, and then when you start talking to them, they aren't so.
They turn out to be approachable and insightful.
Listen to this podcast, or I'll gouge your eyes out.
I also finally finished Stranger Things, season 3, and I really liked it. I felt like this was more of a horror series than the last season was, where the first season was like a tribute to various things of the 80s, Steven Spielberg, Stephen King, obviously with the title credits and the font.
Yeah.
And E.T., I saw a lot of horror influence on it, and it had a lot of that. Season 2, the horror elements seemed to be dialed back a little bit. This one dialed the horror elements back up. And it actually had some pretty good CGI in it. I know I'm in the minority in this because a lot of people have complained about the CGI in it, but for a television series, it looks better than a lot of movies do.
Yeah.
I think.
The people been complaining about the CGI, I thought it was really strong.
Overall, I enjoyed this more than season 2. I really liked season 1. Season 2 for me was fine, but it felt like it wasn't doing anything original or new or nothing I hadn't seen before. This one wasn't that it did something a lot different. It just did it with a much bigger intensity.
Yeah.
And the stakes felt higher. The horror elements were pumped up. And it had the benefit of having Maya Hawke on it. We talked about last week, Uma Thurman's and Ethan Hawke's daughter.
She's awesome.
She is my favorite part of the series now. She was my favorite character, the one that was the most endearing to me. Could see
Very
in
natural.
in her DNA that she's an actress.
Yeah.
There's a scene where she actually comes out to Steve, and it was actually a very, very touching scene, and it was really well acted. I liked the Dustin character. All of that side subplot having to do with the Russians, I actually preferred a little bit to the main storyline. But regardless, the monsters were good, and I was overall very satisfied with the season. I like how it's ending, but I can see why the Duffer Brothers are thinking about closing it off after one more season, because I'm like, it feels like the story's coming to an end. It doesn't feel like this is something that you can do, like, have this happen every year, a new threat. Otherwise, it's going to start to seem ridiculous.
Yeah, how much farther can you go with these particular characters?
But
they've done pretty much everything you can do with them. I'm sure they got another fresh idea for the new season.
And I'm sorry if I spoiled the Maya Hawke thing for any of our listeners, but I'm not going to spoil the end or anything else, so don't worry. It's the only thing.
And while this is an homage to a lot of 80s movies and stuff, I've always considered, especially this season, wholly original. Mm-hmm. It has certain elements that we're familiar with and that awakens our nostalgia, but it also has a lot of really original stuff going on and characters that feel original. They don't feel like copies from 80s characters we're familiar with. They take the 80s concepts and stuff and the
Breathe
campiness,
new life.
yeah, the campiness and stuff and of the 80s and the stuff that was indicative of that time isn't there. It's like quality acting, quality writing, and realistic, and it's not for like the fun 80s romp purposes,
The never-ending story. That's all I'm going to say. I'm not going to ruin that. If you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, and if the
Don't
rest,
say what that is. That's all I'm going to say.
If the rest of the season hadn't been so solid, that wouldn't have worked for me. It would have been too adorable.
It was kind of adorable.
Because of the season was so good and so exciting and so tense, it seemed like a welcome kind of kickback, kind of sweet moment.
It was
such
sweet.
an intense series.
I thought it might have been a little bit questionable, but it didn't throw it off for me.
Yeah.
But it's a little bit, it's adorable.
And from what I hear, fucking Steve did a lot of his own stunts. Some of that fighting they were doing with Steve and with Hopper especially, and pretty much almost all the characters got in a knockdown, drag-out fight with some nefarious criminal throughout the whole thing, or some monster or something. So they really put him through the ringer, and to know that Steve did some of his own stunts, even really hit his head at one point, I think.
That's dedication. Got a little Tom Cruise right there.
I'm the type of filmmaker who puts a lot of action. I try to put a lot of action in my horror, a lot of fighting. So I just love that so much hand-to-hand combat is
very visceral.
Yeah, especially Hopper. How many times did he fight that big Russian guy? And he kept beating his ass every time.
All right, did you get Terminator vibes from that?
Yeah.
There's a Russian character that goes around, and he looks like he's dressed like Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yeah.
He acts like it, and I think it takes place in 1985, which I believe is like a year after the first Terminator would have came out. I got heavy Terminator vibes off of that.
And he had the unstoppable type of
The mentality, he was ruthless, implacable. Whether next season's the last or they're going to stretch it out to 2 seasons, I don't know. I just hope they end it right, that they don't... Seems like they're not going to pull a Walking Dead with Stranger Things.
I love how well they balance so many characters. I felt like I spent a lot of time with every single character on that show. I don't think anybody was left out. And it never felt jumbled. It always felt well balanced. It had a good balance of comedy, horror, action, drama. It had a good balance of everything. I'm just so impressed with these Duffer Brothers. I can't say enough about them. There's a couple other very interesting horror events I went to. One was at the UCLA Film and Television Archive at the Hammer Museum. I went to see a restored old Mexican-made horror film from 1988 called Don't Panic. And it's considered some type of a Nightmare on Elm Street ripoff, but only because certain tonal elements were similar to Nightmare on Elm Street.
What year did it come out?
88.
88? Okay.
The main demon looked like Freddy Krueger. He had like a Freddy Krueger type of makeup on. His dead friend would do stuff like push his face through a TV with static on it, similar to the way that Freddy pushed his way through a wall in Nightmare on Elm Street. But those are really the only similarities. Okay, so it's at the Hammer Museum. Also there to introduce the movie and talk about it afterwards was the Shockwaves podcast. Rebecca McKendry was there, Elric was there, and Rob Galuzzo. So 3 of the 4 Shockwaves podcast people were there, along with the founders of the American Genre Film Archive. Those are the ones who they start take. Actually, it's the UCLA Film and Television Archive, and they started a separate division dedicated to just genre films. So there's movies in there that have been there for years and just never taken out and restored. So it's I think it's the second largest film archive in the U.S. So they just pulled this one out, dusted it off, and remastered it and restored it and everything, and it looked really good. But it was completely ridiculous. This guy is supposed to be 17, but he looked about 30 years old. And his friend gives him a Ouija board as a gift. It was some weird thing with the Ouija board. He has some kind of past with it, and he gets pissed at his friend for giving it to him. He starts getting premonitions of bizarre killings that happen all over town. The killings were really awesome. They veered from really brutal to ridiculous, and they were all just entertaining, just fun, and the energy of the film was really popping. And this guy, you know, like I said before, he plays a guy who's 17, but he looks around 30, and he runs around town through half of it with these really unique dinosaur pajamas on that they look like they should be on a 6 or 7-year-old kid. They were talking about the people who restored it even talked about trying to get a hold of those pajamas, but they can't find them. It was overdubbed in English, but it was the actors were speaking in English. It's one of those where they just overdubbed the whole thing just to get a better audio sound. One more thing that's similar to Nightmare on Elm Street, the mom has a drinking problem, except this mom, they have to keep announcing it in the story, and then the mom actually says it herself sometimes. Well, you know, I have a drinking problem.
It's almost like The Room. That type of dialogue.
But it was actually much better made than The Room.
No, I know that. I'm just saying the
Yeah.
dialogue you're describing, that's implying that the movie's that quality.
But it was made by people who knew what they were doing, but I don't know, just some absurd moments. I guess there were several movies, Mexican movies made like this, who were kind of taking their version of the horror films that were coming out in American culture and making their own versions of them. So they'd have these weird caricatures of how they think Americans act. So it makes for a really interesting viewing, even when they're bad, you know. And this one was directed by Ruben Galindo Jr. It was written and directed by him, and apparently he directed a lot of those at that time. So I recommend checking out more of that director from that time, because I definitely will be.
Listen to this podcast, or I'll stab your eardrums with an ice pick.
I watched Lords of Chaos, the 2018 film directed by Jonas Ackerland, the music video director who's done music videos for Madonna, Lady Gaga, And
Yeah,
he's
he
the director
did.
of Spun.
Yeah, he did the Madonna's Ray of Light. He did a bunch of YouTube videos. Ozzy Osbourne, Rammstein.
Rammstein, that's who I was thinking of.
And after seeing this, I want to see his new movie on Netflix, Polar.
Well, I always really liked Spun, and I always was a fan of that movie, but it never really caught on or became a thing with most people, and it wasn't really well reviewed. It didn't make much of an impression, but I've always really liked it, mostly for the stylistic touches of it. I could tell it's definitely from a music video director,
Yeah.
but I like how it was about crystal meth, and it kind of captured the boppy insanity of what it would be like to be addicted to a drug like that.
Yeah.
So I can see traces of that here, and I could definitely tell that this is a music video director, and especially in some of the touches that he applies. A couple of vaguely surrealistic scenes, but it's a lot more realistic and grounded than Spun. It's not like a hyperactive movie that's constantly bouncing around and seems vaguely unbelievable. This is a very serious film about a serious story.
And I was in a metal band for 8 years, and this seems like it was made by someone who was in a metal band, who knows what it's like to be in a metal band.
So, for those of you who don't know, the audience members who don't know, Lords of Chaos is based on a true story of the metal band Mayhem, who were the first Norwegian black metal musicians, and it charts how they came to be, what they went through, how they started, and how it got a little bit out of control. They took their soul message so seriously that the band became responsible for the burning down of churches in Norway, which was a big deal. They eventually got involved in murder, and and we're gonna have to spoil this movie for the audience only because you can't really have a good discussion of this film without discussing what happens.
Yeah.
But just to let you know, the story is already out there, and many of you may already know what the story is and how it ends. But it's a very interesting look at the music scene in the 1980s, the late 1980s, around when black metal was starting to form and new sound was starting to come out of there.
It's interesting in a few different ways. It's interesting as the portrait of a band coming up from nothing. It's also a good portrait of how fame can get out of hand and how fandom can get out of hand with the poser, Varg. I'm sure he doesn't consider himself a poser, and his fans don't consider him a poser, but I do. And that's not just from watching the movie, it's from learning more about him. Because that's one thing about this movie, it makes you want to learn more about it. And especially, it starts out by saying, based on truth, lies, and what actually happened. And that's really what it's based on. Because the more I found out about it afterwards, because I was fascinated to find out what was exactly inaccurate, where did the lies come from. And from what I found out, this is compiled from stories from all the different band members and all the people involved.
As
And
well
it's
as police reports.
Yeah.
Actual police
And
reports.
A lot of them go against Varg, make him look pretty bad in making him look like more of a poser than maybe he was, and also making him look more like he was responsible for the church burnings mostly.
Just to clarify for our audience, Varg is a character who's not originally part of the band Mayhem. It charts the beginning of this band and how they're starting to make a big, like a big splash on the scene with their live performances. And the character of Varg, whose real name is Christian, approaches them after a concert and tries to tell them what a big fan he is and what an awesome show they put on. But since they're such fucking assholes in the way that they behave, and they're just trying to turn people off and just, be evil or be like truly evil, they just the leader of the band, Euronymous, played by Rory Culkin, who's actually very good in this film.
Yes.
He looks at him and he notices he has a Scorpions patch on him, which the cheesy 80s metal hairband, and he just points at it and looks at him with disgust. So you could tell that this guy was really hurt, but then he insinuates his way back into the lives of this band, because Euronymous ended up opening his own record shop, and he did this as a way to try to market the black metal scene and create a true, as he says, true original Norwegian black metal.
Yeah.
And the character Christian, who changes his name to Varg, always frequents the store, and he starts approaching him and trying to insinuate himself in the group, and eventually Euronymous finds out that he's actually really talented. he drops him a tape of something that he did as a one-man band.
Yeah, that was a great moment in the movie.
And he said, this music is evil. It's a masterpiece. So he starts recording with them. And what's interesting is that the character of, Christian Varg, comes across as a very innocent, even naive young person at the beginning of the movie. And it's a very realistic and scary escalation into where he started off where he was kind of a poser. He didn't know much about the scene, but he was very talented, so he got accepted, to the point where he was too real and too down with a lot of the message behind the music.
Yeah.
It became not just an image thing for him. And the original band, one of the original band members, Dead, actually killed himself.
Yeah, and that was the most disturbing scene of the film for me.
There's a suicide in this movie, and beware, this is a fucking rough suicide where he cuts his arms, both of his arms, cuts his own throat, slashes it, and he's still alive, and blows his own head off with a shotgun. So he's one of the original singers for the band. They actually used that as the album cover to, get notoriety.
Yeah, and
as the image of him dead with the shotgun, and they even moved some things around to make it look more morbid. The knife that he cut himself with, they framed it better and everything. But their album cover is just that, a picture of their bandmate with his head blown off and his throat slashed and his arm slashed.
Yeah,
so
and
it's pretty. It started off in a pretty dark place.
Yeah, as nasty and disturbing as that scene is, it's pretty much exactly how it happened, because he actually cut his arms open and cut his throat, and then that's when he started writing his suicide note. And he acknowledges that the blood is starting to clot too much, and it wasn't flowing enough for him. And he said, it looks like I'm going to have to blow my head off, and that's what he does. And I felt so loopy by that time, because it already showed kind of...
And it looks very realistic.
Yeah, it already showed Euronymous coming up, and he found this new guitar sound that defined this black metal, this new black metal sound, and then
which sounds really evil.
Yeah, and he tried to find the most evil, fucked up singer that he could with the greatest sound, and he got someone who I think was very talented and had something special in this guy who called himself Dead, and
he's a very disturbed individual,
yeah.
as you can see in the movie. He cuts himself on stage, bleeds onto the audience. Yeah. It's almost kind of what the Sex Pistols or Iggy Pop did, that punk scene. Yeah. But a lot of punk is political, and it's meant to have a positive message behind it. These guys are about destruction, despair, like it just giving into your sickest, most darkest impulses.
Yeah.
And the decision by the singer, by the leader of the band, Euronymous, to pose his bandmate in that way almost seems kind of cold and cruel. Like he just doesn't care, that he's just going to use that as a marketing ploy. And he's kind of not a very good person at the beginning of the movie. And at least I didn't root for him, even though I saw a lot of the talent behind him.
Yeah.
And it shows how he created a really bad situation for himself. Because when he brought in Varg to be a part of the band and as a solo act for his record label, he was a very innocent, naive person who was just very talented. And he kept egging him on, well, if you don't want to be a poser, do this, do something more extreme. And he kept egging him and pushing him to his place, to the point where Varg got out of control and started burning down churches. One of the other bandmates commits murder, a hate crime that's actually really fucking disturbing to watch. Yeah. All the stabbings in this movie are really, really realistic.
Yeah, and they both went a little too far for me, especially that last one, because it's a character that, despite his flaws and he's shitty in a lot of ways, you still care about him when he's killed.
Yeah, and you don't expect it to happen so brutally, but that's how it actually happened. I need to stop saying that. Was actually stabbed. Euronymous actually was stabbed multiple times, a lot, and he was found all the way downstairs from his apartment. Like they went through the hallway and everything. So the death scenes, for the most part, seem like they're pretty accurate.
And this is a death that Varg claims was self-defense,
which I personally think is bullshit, especially the way that he frames it. But I'm not gonna.
Yeah, and it seems there seems to be a lot of hate for this movie because of how much the guy Varg denies of how things went down. But the stuff that he denies is He denies any of the church burnings, which
He confessed to.
He clearly confessed to and
even
bragged about, and gave details that the
Only the cops
police,
would have.
Yeah, the police had not released to the public, and he claims that it's self-defense that he killed Euronymous when he went all the way to his apartment.
And the other bandmate who drove him there said he knew he was going to kill him, and he just didn't give a shit. Like, these are really awful people that don't seem to care. And the environment that Euronymous sets up is what escalates the situation to the point where Varg actually starts to do things that Euronymous only talks about. And it puts the pressure on Euronymous to do something worse and to top each other. And then another bandmate, Faust, gets involved and kills a man at a gay bar, lures him outside, and stabs him relentlessly, like really just torturous the way it's done. Yeah. And it creates this toxic environment where they're always just trying to one up each other to see who can do the more awful thing, who's the worst person, and just about falling completely into the depths of despair, where even Euronymous seems overwhelmed by it. After all, he didn't expect it to go to that level or to get that out of hand.
Yeah, and the poser ends up doing things that are worse than anyone else because he has the most to prove.
At the end, he's not a poser anymore, though. He's the realest person there. But he was better off as a poser.
Yeah, Euronymous was actually the poser, but that's the type of thing. If you're into something like that, it's good to be a poser. It's not good to love murder and destruction and shit like that, and devil worship and shit like that.
You know? We're into horror for fun. We love the fun of it, where horror is like a thing, but doesn't mean we're actually going to go out and kill people, or we're into that. Like, they actually took their music deathly seriously. They're a group of very talented kids, but they didn't know what the fuck they were doing. They were way in over their head. Yeah. It's quite a story, and it's what I would call it, like, real life horror. Yeah. How a simple situation can escalate. And if you're a fan of metal music or any fan of like the history of if you're interested in anything that is about the founding of a music scene, this is among the most interesting stories that you could ever hear, because it goes beyond just the invention of a music scene. It goes into murder, arson, all out insanity by the end of it.
And even before you get to all the church burnings and all the grandiose type of stuff, you had this really small, intimate story about this really talented singer who was just so tortured. I mean, he was the only genuinely dark person in this. I mean,
the original one of the original singer dead, who kills himself. Yeah. But the difference is that he's a very destructive and dark soul, but he's only inwardly destructive. Most of the destruction is aimed at himself. So as bad as it is, he's only a danger. As bad as he is, he's only a danger to himself. These other people became a danger to society at large.
So when Dead was a singer, it was more of a sadness that was brought to their music and their whole existence. But then once he died in such a horrible, violent way, and then he became a part of their future by being on their album, one of their album covers. And he kind of alluded toward that, like he wanted them to do that in the suicide note. He said, "Here, basically take what I've created right here, which I've completely destroyed myself. Do what the fuck you want with it." So he basically gave them the blessing to...
His character is so morbid. Well, I'm not the character, I keep saying that. He was so morbid, the way he came across in the movie, that it seems like he would have wanted them to pose his body in a very obscene manner.
Yeah, and by the way, played very awesomely by Jack Kilmer, which is Val Kilmer's son.
And from what I understand, according to most people who are like fans of this music, of the subgenre, and people involved, his is the most accurate portrayal of any of the people in there. That he has the most spot on of what Dead was really like.
Yeah, and besides the gore that was involved in the scene, the look on his face while he was doing it was the thing that haunted me afterwards, and I had nightmares about it that night. And I thought about it all the next day, to the point where I wanted to study everything that this guy had done, what had made him so sad. And come to find out, he had talked about something in his in one of his songs where he almost drowned and he came close to death. And that near-death experience is what made him so sad, like he didn't belong in this world anymore. And what I found out is he lied about that in the song. It was actually he got beat up by bullies at school so bad that he almost died, and I think he actually died for a little bit and was brought
For a
back to
second
life.
was brought. Yeah, it's like legally died.
Yeah.
Actually died.
So it's such a sad and tragic story to be followed by these guys that had this petty competition.
A really petty competition.
Yeah, and they kind of exploited the deep sadness that this person had.
And they took it to a whole new extreme.
Yeah.
So one of the things I found interesting is that Varg actually killed Euronymous. He's free now. He only spent 15 years in prison. He lives in France. Had a child in 2007. Is married and I believe had a second child. This fucker is free.
Yeah.
He should be rotting in prison as far as I'm concerned. That guy does not have a right to be out. I think that's fucking absolutely outrageous that this guy is out.
Apparently his wife is a piece of shit just like him because she was arrested along with him in the recent years for inciting racial hatred.
Which is actually a crime in France because he's actually a neo-Nazi and has a blog. And this is why he's another reason where I feel like he doesn't have any credibility to me when he says that it's not accurate. He doesn't like that he's portrayed as a poser. He had a blog where he's claiming to be a neo-Nazi and spreading a lot of racial division and a lot of bigotry and hatred.
Yeah.
And then he says, well, I didn't write those even though they're on my blog. And I'm like, bullshit, dude. You know how fucking stupid you think we are. You're just trying to fucking get out of something. Like, we're not that dumb. And the things that he says, the way that he goes about, the way that he's carried himself and all the research, I just don't believe. I don't believe it, and I think it's crazy that he's free, but such is the world.
Yeah, and what was it? I think it was a total of 21 years he spent in prison.
So he's out right now.
I started watching, I haven't finished it yet. I started watching a documentary on this. It's Before the Light Takes Us. It's on Shudder. And
It's a very fascinating subject.
yeah, and it pisses me off because it shows way too much Varg, and he gets way too much of a voice, which is why he's kind of swayed a lot of fans over these years to make them think that this wasn't him, that he wasn't this power-hungry poser.
Even if he wasn't a poser like that, that doesn't make anything that he did any less despicable. Let's say he wasn't a poser and he was really that hardcore from the beginning. I'm like, doesn't make his actions any less trashy or excusable.
No.
So even that's a hard thing for me to buy.
And even Euronymous, even though you end up almost sympathizing with him toward the end, even though he's a despicable person as well.
He's a despicable person in his own way, but you end up feeling bad for him. You could almost seem like the way that I interpret his character, especially towards the end of the film, as things become a little bit more clear, is that he was a teenager when his bandmate Dead killed himself. And he reacted at what seemed like such a cold, cavalier way. But you realize that this was just a young, dumb kid who didn't know what he was doing and didn't know how to deal with his grief, the loss over his friend, somebody who's dark. So he just went inward and started creating, no, we're evil, we're just selling that. And I think it was something of a coping mechanism for him. So in the end, it probably went a lot further, than it was supposed to, even though it was a hell of his own making.
And that was one of the only problems I had with the film is... first of all, doing such a character flip-flop for me, where he was a believable character and it seemed to match a lot of the stories, and then it went to him acting a little more innocent and having tender moments with his girlfriend, who, by the way, was that character was invented for the movie.
Made up to give him sympathy.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it was a little bit too much of a flip-flop character to all of a sudden let's be sympathetic towards him, and then to make you feel that sympathetic towards him in a fake way, and then brutalize him so bad in the final scene. That's what kind of turned me off about it. But then the more I research, the more I see that stabbing was realistic. So it really it really did have no dignity like that, and it really did show the cold-blooded nature of this Varg. You just end up hating him by the end.
And it's just a total... The story is really fascinating, and I'd recommend any of our listeners to check it out. If you're a metalhead, you got to see this. Even if you don't like the portrayal of Varg, it's an interesting story. Or if you don't know anything about it, really, I'd say check out. Of the things that I've watched from the shows where I really dug Stranger Things, and I really liked elements about Scream. I know this isn't brand new, it's from last year. This is the most impressive watch for me in the past week.
Yeah, and it really struck a nerve with me because I was telling you that I was in a band for 8 years.
A metal
And
band, too.
It was a metal band, and I done a lot of screaming and growling in my vocals, and it called for a certain type of crowd that was really challenging to please them. Like we would play at all these random places, and these big meatheads would come up to me and say, "You better kick our ass tonight. Your music better be awesome." So I had to turn it up to 10 and put everything I had, leave everything I had on stage, and almost perform to the point where I wanted to puke. It was so bad. But it's this challenge to be the toughest out there, to be the craziest, to be the darkest. But then this movie and this story took that type of feeling to a whole new level, and it felt very authentic to me. And then the places that it went, it wasn't that far from the influence to be darker and to be something larger than yourself and meaner than yourself.
But this went way out of hand than it normally does.
The pressure is there, but this is turned up to 10 because it had just a handful of personalities involved in the core creation of it, that it became so dark and incited so much mental illness, is what it boils down to. Because each of these characters had a severe mental illness for different reasons. Mm-hmm. Like the Euronymous character, he had a background in Satanism. He was just interested in dark and gothic and macabre things since he was little. But then you see Varg, which he grew up on Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing games. So he was all Lord of the Rings. So that's where his lyrics came from. That's where his name came from. Was all these fantasy things. So he was living in a fantasy world, while Euronymous was delving into dark things because that's what his interest was. He just took it too far when he's seen the power of popularity, especially when you create a movement. And it was a movement that was so important to that music that a lot of standard metal bands were changing their sound to sound more like these guys. And it kind of sucks that someone like Varg came up in that scene and he's just as influential as the rest.
What's most upsetting about it is that for all these are mostly terrible people that we see on screen, and most of the actions aren't really forgivable. But these kids were very talented musicians. I'm not a really big black metal person, but I can recognize talent and musicianship, and these guys were very, very talented. And I mean, you have to be talented if you're going to build a whole new music scene and be that influential.
And a lot of talented artists have demons similar to what these guys do, but what made it go to such extreme measures where it...
Just the right blend of personalities to pop off a whole little situation.
And it's really fascinating to see it go from the singer Dead, who internalizes his pain and his grief and his darkness, and then it kind of devolves into them expressing their darkness and their wannabe darkness with murder and destruction. It's just a fascinating story, and I thought this director done really well with it. Rory Culkin was awesome in it, and Jack Kilmer, Val Kilmer's son, was great in it, and I'll never forget that performance from him. I really want to see what else this guy does, because apparently he's a reluctant actor. He didn't really want to get into the business, but he's in it now because I got to see more from him. And speaking of that, that comes to the end of this podcast. So we both loved Lords of Chaos.
We both loved Lords of Chaos. And it seems overall we seem to have enjoyed what we watched. Even the worst thing I watched, Scream, ended up being worthwhile for me. Well, until next week, happy horror.
Happy horror, everyone.